Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Landor LINKS webinar on pavement parking road safety, accessibility and the future of local enforcement. Today's webinar is sponsored by Ethos Consulting, and we have a lineup of three speakers today. What I'm first going to do, though, is ask Devolve to put a poll up on the screen. We have 6 questions that we'd really like your input on. Ideally, we wanted to do them as we were going through, but unfortunately, I couldn't work out how to do that. Those of you who know me know that technology isn't my strong point, but they've just appeared. So perhaps if you could answer these questions, and then they will aid us in discussion towards the end. I will let the speakers introduce themselves, but just as a brief discussion point while the poll is up there, and if you could do that as soon as possible. As you all know, there was a public consultation in 2020, or a long time ago, called Options for Change. And the DfT has recently announced that LAs outside London will be given the powers to introduce pavement parking restrictions. I'm aware that some have taken this up already, but not many. So today we're going to discuss the pros, the cons, the options, and the problems. And it is a problem. And this did happen to me this morning. I went out for a quick run. And whilst running along a road, a car was parked fully on the pavement. I had to step into the road to run around it, and the car behind me beeped, which slightly annoyed me, but also made me laugh as I knew I was about to do the webinar this morning. So it happens, and I see it all the time. So it's a very real live issue that's happening at the moment. I hope you're voting on the poll, but if you also have any questions, please could you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We have had over 50 questions come in already, and we've got over 500 people on this webinar, which is great news, but I will try and get through as many questions as I can at the end. I know the panel of Tanya, Nick and Adam are very eager to answer them and try and assist where we can. I'm filling now because I want as many as possible to answer the poll, but I think what I'm going to do is move on to the next slide and just quickly introduce the speakers for you. We can't have the poll and the slides at the same time, I believe. So speaking today are Adam Bunce, who's the Managing Director of Ethos Consulting, Tanya Braun, who's the Director of External Affairs and Fundraising from Living Streets, and Nick Lester-Davis, who is a long-serving traffic and parking consultant. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for your time. And again, thank you, Ethos, for sponsoring. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Adam. And in the meantime, Adam, I'm going to be reviewing the polls, and perhaps we can have a discussion on some of the questions at the end of your presentation. And if not, we will certainly have them at the end. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Gavin. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. Appreciate your time. As Gavin said, my name's Adam Bunce, and I'm the Managing Director of Ethos. Obviously, the focus today is on pavement parking, but I'm looking at this sort of from a less of an enforcement perspective, despite the title, but more sort of through 2 lenses. And firstly, that's going to be sort of around road safety and accessibility. And then secondary, sort of what that means in practice for how local authorities respond, because I think the want to reduce the impact of pavement parking is absolutely fantastic, but how we go about doing that is very complex and very challenging. And that's because the issues are just a lot more complex than what is often presented. So we do need to sort of think about this from a more holistic approach. If we move on, just by way of introduction, Ethos is a transport consultancy, and we have extensive experience working in the public sector, and our expertise is mainly focused around sort of 3 key work streams, and they are parking, active travel, and road safety. Now, pavement parking is actually probably a perfect example to demonstrate how you can't actually deal with one of these areas without having an impact across all 3, because they are all interrelated. We've worked with local authorities across the UK, and that gives us a great insight into projects that work well and elements of best practice that we can draw upon. Next slide. Before getting into solutions, I want to start by sort of reframing how we think about pavement parking, because in many cases it's still treated primarily as a sort of a compliance or an enforcement issue, and that's understandable. It doesn't actually fully capture the impact in how streets function, particularly for pedestrians and more vulnerable users. What this means in practice is that we can sometimes end up focusing on the symptom, the parked vehicle, rather than the effect it's having on the wider network. So instead, I think it's helpful to think about pavement parking in three slightly different ways. Firstly, as a risk allocation issue, because what's really happening is the space, and therefore the risk is being reallocated from the footway, which is designed for pedestrians, into the carriageway where interaction with traffic occurs, much like Gavin's had today. Secondly, the footway is obstructed. It's no longer functioning as intended, sort of particularly for vulnerable users, so for wheelchair users, for those with pushchairs. It becomes a constraint within the walking and wheeling network rather than continuous usable route. I experienced that more than most because I have twins, and when they were babies, having a double pushchair and trying to negotiate a footway at the best of times could be challenging. If you had parked vehicles, it became impossible, and nothing is more scarier than trying to travel along with your newborns when you've got cars sort of trying to pass and getting quite cross because you're in perceived to be their space, despite the fact that there's clearly no other where to go. So in many cases, pavement parking actually sort of reflects underlying issues such as sort of the actual street design, vehicle size, which is obviously growing, and I think that's probably a whole different webinar in itself, and parking demand, rather than simply sort of individual behaviour. So it's often a response to pressure within the symptom rather than the root cause itself. And that shift in perspective is important because once you start to see pavement parking in those terms as a function of risk, accessibility, and capacity, it naturally leads to sort of a different type of response than maybe just looking at it in isolation. Okay, next slide. At a basic level, pavement parking disrupts how streets are intended to function. It blocks pedestrian desire lines and it forces people to adapt their route in real time. In practice, that might mean stepping around a vehicle, navigating into the carriageway, or trying to pass through a constrained gap, often with very little time to properly assess traffic conditions or the actual visibility that you've got to deal with, especially if you've got junctions and bends. What's important here is the movement becomes less predictable. Pedestrians are no longer following clear, continuous routes that are designed for them. They're making reactive decisions based on immediate constraints. And that shift to sort of that reactive behaviour introduces risk, particularly on streets where you've got higher traffic speeds, limited visibility, or where pedestrian demand is very high. So on residential streets that might have lots of parked cars, they might have lots of houses, roads near town centres are just some of the roads where you're going to see this a lot. Next slide. So what we've looked to try and do here is actually sort of identify the sort of the risk elements, and that pavement parking doesn't remove risk, it simply transfers it. So when a footway is obstructed, pedestrians are displaced, and the protected space that they once had has now gone because they are now moving into the live carriageway, and where they are exposed to moving traffic. And that traffic could be moving very fast in certain situations. In many cases, the movement happens because it's the constrained conditions are close to parked vehicles. And like I said, sort of with limited visibility and without gaps in traffic, pedestrians are required to sort of make very quick reactive decisions rather than following that sort of continuous route that is designed for them. And that's problematic because the carriageway isn't designed for pedestrian movement in the same way as the footway is, goes without saying. There's less separation, there's higher speeds, and the predictability is a lot less. So the risk isn't located at the point where the vehicle is parked, it's created by the displacement that follows. And that shift is sort of very much the act of parking itself and the consequences it creates within the wider street environment. Next slide. I think it's also important to recognise that the impact doesn't affect everyone equally. For some people, pavement parking is simply an inconvenience, something they can step around or adapt relatively easily. In certain situations, it is going to be more of an inconvenience because the actual road itself might cause concerns, but dealing with that is something that can be managed. But for others, it presents a much more significant issue. For wheelchair users, for visually impaired pedestrians, and parents and carers with pushchairs, and even older people, even a partial obstruction can remove the ability to pass safely along the footway. And in those situations, there often isn't a safe or viable alternative route. There may not be a dropped curb to allow people to get off the footway. So if you're in a wheelchair, if you've got a pushchair, that can be very difficult to manage. So what we're seeing is not just disruption, it's actually exclusion. Certain users are disproportionately affected and in some cases prevented from using the space altogether. And that's why this isn't just a parking issue. It's fundamentally an accessibility issue, and one that sits closely alongside sort of wider expectations around inclusive design and equal access onto the network. Next slide. So what does that mean? That means it's creating a clear tension with wider policy. We're investing heavily in measures, really positive measures, such as 20 mile an hour environment, school streets, and active travel infrastructure, all of which are designed to improve safety, accessibility, and the overall quality of the street environment. But pavement parking can directly undermine those objectives if not addressed. For example, a 20 mile an hour environment is intended to reduce risk, make people feel safer. But if pedestrians are being displaced into the carriageway, the risk is still present and in many cases maybe more extreme than if it wasn't. School streets are designed to prioritise children and families, but obstructed footways can make those routes less safe and accessible. And active travel investment is very much focusing on trying to encourage people to walk and cycle more, but that relies upon having a safe, continuous, usable space. So there's a clear disconnect between the intent of policy and the reality that is on the ground. And that's why this isn't an isolated issue, why we can't just look at it from an enforcement perspective. It cuts across many policy areas, and if not considered sort of appropriately, it can limit the effectiveness of those wider interventions. Next slide. So if we accept that pavement parking is fundamentally a safety and accessibility issue, the next question is, how do we respond in practice? And that is the biggest challenge because it is very complex. Because unlike other transport issues, there isn't really sort of a single straightforward solution. The problem isn't considered across the network. It varies from street to street depending on many factors, road safety, sort of the road width, traffic conditions and parking demand, sort of all just some of those issues. At the same time, any intervention has consequences. Addressing pavement parking can affect parking capacity, change traffic patterns and create pressures elsewhere on the network. So what are we really sort of dealing with here is a set of trade-offs between safety, accessibility, capacity and practicability. And that's why it requires a more sort of structured and considered approach rather than purely reactive or enforcement-led responses. Next slide, please. Having reframed pavement parking as more than just a behaviour issue, it's important to understand why it's happening in the first place, because in many cases what we're seeing on the ground is not random, it's the result of a number of underlying and structural factors. Firstly, there's the street design limitations. A lot of our residential streets were designed decades ago, if not longer, when both vehicle sizes and the levels of car ownership were significantly lower. So quite simply, the physical space available on many streets today isn't aligned with how they're being used. But the most significant change that we've seen is in car ownership. On average, car ownership has increased from around 0.8 vehicles per household historically to around 1.2 today. And that might not sound like a big shift at first, but when you actually apply it to a real street, the impact becomes much clearer. Take as an example, a fairly standard residential street with 100 properties. Historically, that street would have been accommodating around 80 vehicles. Today, that same street is now accommodating closer to 120 vehicles. That's an increase of around 40 additional cars just in one street, or roughly a 50% increase in demand, with no corresponding increase in available space. And those additional vehicles don't just disappear, they have to be absorbed somewhere, and it's usually within the street. And that's where pavement parking sort of begins to emerge, because people realise that if you park on the pavement, then potentially you might be able to increase the demand potentially as much as 50% if you can achieve pavement parking on both sides of a standard residential road. In many areas, decisions have been made over time to maximise parking capacity, often sort of in segmental ways, without necessarily considering longer term impacts on accessibility or the actual street function. And finally, there's the issue of unchanged space allocation. While demand has increased and vehicles have grown in size, the way that the space is allocated within the street hasn't fundamentally changed. The footway is still the footway, the road is still the road. So you end up with a growing mismatch between demand and what the street can physically accommodate. Next slide. Having understood the safety and accessibility implications, this is where the issue becomes much more challenging in practice, because for most authorities, pavement parking isn't a simple fix. It presents a genuine strategic dilemma. And broadly, what we see is that there are three main directions you can take. The first option is enforcement, and on the face of it, it's probably the most straightforward. You remove pavement parking, you restore the footway, and you improve safety and accessibility. Sounds perfect. But the trade-off is immediate. You reduce the effective parking capacity, and those vehicles aren't just going to disappear. They are displaced into surrounding streets where you create new pressures elsewhere on the network. So then you're resulting in just moving the problem elsewhere. The second option is formalisation. This is where authorities allow some level of controlled encroachment on the footway, typically in locations where the street simply can't function otherwise, and where you can have an element of pavement parking while still allowing traffic to flow and pedestrians to move. It can be a pragmatic solution, but it comes with its own challenges. You need clear criteria, you need consistency, and importantly, there's always a balance to strike, because you may still be compromising accessibility to some extent. And then the third option is to redesign. And this is the more sort of fundamental solution. It involves rethinking how space is allocated, potentially reducing carriageway width, removing parking, widening footways, or introducing alternative layouts. This is the only option that truly aligns demand with the available space, but it's also the most complex because it requires design, development, consultation, and often difficult decisions around the prioritization of that space that you are dealing with. So what this slide is really sort of illustrating is that there isn't sort of really a single correct answer. Each option involves trade-offs between safety, accessibility, capacity, and cost. And the right approach will vary depending on the specific content of the street. And I'll come on to how we can potentially deal with that in a second. Next slide, please. Having looked at the strategic dilemma, our next question is, why is it still such a challenge in practice? And we tend to see across most local authorities that there's a key step missing in how pavement parking is often managed. At the moment, most approaches are reactive. They just have to be, because we've got limited resource and limited funding. Issues are typically addressed as they arise, often driven by complaints, local pressure, or specific problem location. And that means interventions tend to be sort of more site by site rather than part of a wider coordinated programme. And while that can resolve individual issues, it doesn't necessarily address the underlying pattern across an area or network. What's often missing is structured prioritisation. There isn't always a consistent framework for deciding where intervention is most needed, what the level of risk is present, or what type of response is appropriate. So decisions can become inconsistent or influenced by complaints and those that are shouting loudest or lobbying the most. And the key reason that matters is because risk isn't uniform. Not all pavement parking creates the same level of impact. In some locations, it could be relatively a minor issue. In others, particularly where footways are narrow and traffic speeds are higher, the demand is significant. It can represent a much more serious safety and accessibility concern. So the fourth point, which leads to sort of the need for a tailored response, is on the sort of the different types of interventions. Some locations may be suitable for enforcement, others may require formalisation, and some might need that more fundamental design. Without a structured way of assessing those differences, it becomes difficult, to say the least, to apply the right solution, which then makes it very challenging for local authorities to act, which is why we don't tend to see much in the way of action and haven't done for many years. Next slide, please. So what we've done is to try and preempt how we can actually deal with pavement parking. And what we've done is we've tried to create a prioritisation risk matrix, which brings more consistency in how pavement parking is assessed and managed. If we start on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is a core assessment framework. What we're looking at is a range of factors that directly influence safety, accessibility risk, and general sort of safety concerns. For example, if there is pavement parking occurring, what is the remaining footway width with that going on? Traffic speed, which affects the severity of any interaction that pedestrians will have if they are displaced into the carriageway. Naturally, the faster traffic's going, the more unsafe that would be. Traffic volume, so how much traffic is actually going along the road. Roads can vary very much so, from quite sort of strategic distributor roads to very small cul-de-sacs that will have very limited traffic movement. Road width and the available parking space and passing space, which determines whether vehicles can pass without requiring sort of pavement encroachment and other aspects that might have an impact on pedestrians. The actual parking arrangement, is it occurring on one side? Is it occurring on both sides? Should it be occurring at all if there's parking restrictions? And the proximity to key sort of trip generators, much in the same way you would assess sort of controlled parking zones. The closer you are to trip generators, the more there's naturally going to be a demand. So rather than rely on a subjective judgment, you're actually sort of starting to build up a structured evidence-based picture of risk. If we then sort of move to the right-hand side, you start to sort of see how that translates into practical output. The individual scores, which are generally sort of assessed between 0 to 5, you could sort of bring together, and that allows individual scores to be sort of categorized into broad priority levels. For example, sort of low, medium, and high priority. And importantly, each of those categories could be linked to a typical response. So lower risk locations might be monitored or require minimal intervention, whereas higher risk locations become priorities for more active measures. And then the sort of the bottom right just starts to sort of show an example of how you can look at this when applying across an area. So you can see multiple roads assessed within defined zones, each with individual scores that reflects the overall risk profile. And that is what starts to give you a clear hierarchy, not just individual streets, but across sort of wider areas. So if we move on to the next slide, and I'll just sort of touch on these very briefly, what we've done here is we've just sort of tried to create a few different examples of how you could assess pavement parking. So with this first example, we are looking at a local distributor road that leads into a town centre. It has a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. There's footways on both sides, and importantly, there's no formalised parking bays due to the nature of the road and the limitations with carriageway width, which means that parking that happens generally requires pavement parking because otherwise traffic flow might not pass. So what that means is we are scoring it based on several factors. People shouldn't be parking there at all because there's parking restrictions in place, but because they are parking on the footway, which has limited width, it does create a key sort of constraint for more vulnerable users. And you can sort of see in the image that wheelchair user struggling to get past despite the fact that the vehicle isn't parked on the footway too much. As we pull this together, we would sort of rate this as a sort of a bit of a medium priority, And because the issue is related to parking on an existing restriction, we'd be looking at enforcement. If we move on to the next example, what we're looking at here is a completely different environment, and we are recommending a redesign because the issue isn't necessarily down to convenience, it's down to absolute necessity. This is a strategic road that links two sort of small towns, but more importantly, there is a school and a nursery located within very close proximity of this image. And the issue is there's nowhere to park. So people needing to drop off their kids on the way to work and to other appointments are doing so here because they can. There's no restrictions to stop it. But that is meaning that there is quite significant pavement parking. So we actually need to look at the road space, what we can do to prevent this from occurring altogether. And then if we move on to the third and final example, we have a completely different situation. Now we have verge parking. So if there is sort of pavement parking that's going on, then chances are it's happening on the grass verge. So whilst we don't want grass verging, and that can detract away from sort of how areas look, in an example like this, we have a relatively sort of small cul-de-sac, so we haven't got too many vehicles other than residential. We're not very close to sort of quite key trip generators. And if we were to remove a bit of verge to allow pavement parking, then we could increase the amount of parking necessary. But we might not want to do that because most residential properties along this street have off-street parking. So it'd be important to actually gauge the thoughts of residents there through a consultation. But very much sort of a formalisation process could be delivered here. If we move on to the next slide, it's just very much touching at a high level how we would sort of go from assessment to delivery. So what we are recommending is breaking areas into manageable zones. So very much like you would do with CPZs. You need to address streets consistently for a clear and transparent assessment. You need to sort of develop that intervention hierarchy, and you want to try and align any sort of consultation with wider TRO programs, because one of the biggest issues that can occur is when you are doing too many consultations and you're trying to sort of deal with too many different types of TROs. So very much sort of look at this holistically and bring things together. So whether that's parking restriction reviews or other aspects, let's try and do it in a more coherent, consistent way. And then if we move on to the next slide, in terms of a sort of a typical timeline, some of you might look at this and laugh with how unrealistic it is. Others might look at it and think we don't take that long, and that's because different local authorities have different pressures. But broadly speaking, we are looking at about a 6-month process from start to finish if we have buy-in from multiple teams and we have the ability to sort of progress through the system in a relatively streamlined process. And that's very much around the actual study, the assessment, the consultation, which is a clear and obvious component of that, the TRO development and the statutory processes, which is often the bit that takes the time, especially when there are resource issues, and then moving out to implementation and monitoring, which obviously is going to be dictated by the size of the area. You'll be pleased to know the next slide is my final slide, and that is just to provide my thanks. Appreciate that pavement parking is very much a comprehensive subject, so I'm more than happy to have further conversations. One of the questions we've got in the poll is around potentially needing to do something in more detail, which we'll be very much to support you with. So yeah, thanks. Over to you, Kevin.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. I hope some of you can see that we've got the results of question 1. I hope that's appeared on your screens. The question was, does your authority currently have a defined approach to pavement parking? And clearly 58%, the answer is no, which is interesting. Actually, not surprising, but interesting, Adam. And a lot of the questions that are coming in on the chat are about a joined up approach, about confusion and about displacement. So certainly that's something we can touch on at the Q&A session at the end. Maybe you can have a think about that. So, you know, if you're parking in one borough and in a different borough or a different place or a different local authority, the rules could potentially be different. So that's certainly a query that's coming in. We're now going to move quickly on to Tanya. Can I ask you a quick question, Tanya, before you start?
Sure.
A lot of the chat is talking about this. Maybe this is probably going to be a stupid question, so I apologise. But a lot of the chat is talking about wheelers, and is that referring to people in wheelchairs and children on bicycles rather than just pedestrians, or is that a really stupid question?
No, not stupid. Yes, people in wheelchairs are
Oh,
wheelers,
okay.
not cyclists. Yeah.
I'm not as dumb as I look then. Thank you. I thought that was it. So, Tanya, thank you very much for joining us. Tanya is, as I said, is Director of External Affairs and Fundraising for Living Streets. I'm very much looking forward to seeing and hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and really great to hear your presentation, Adam. Really informative. So, Deval, if you can just skip through my first slide. Gavin's introduced me, but I wanted to just introduce Living Streets for those of you who don't know us. We are the UK charity for everyday walking, but we were set up in 1929 as the Pedestrians Association. So very much a campaign group lobbying for better road safety for people on foot. And in our early days, in the sort of 1930s, we had a lot of success at bringing in policies that supported and protected pedestrians, like the zebra crossing, driving tests in the UK, and urban speed limits. So about 50 years ago, we started a campaign on a ban for pavement parking. And my presentation's kind of taking a little bit of a step back from what Adam just ran through and looking at sort of why we feel we need this prohibition throughout England, and the human side of why that's so important. So Deval, if you could move on to the next slide, please. So we started issuing pamphlets in the 1980s onto cars, trying to show the reason why we didn't want cars parked on the pavement. Very much to protect pedestrian safety. It is very much a road safety issue, but it is also an accessibility issue, which I will get onto in a little bit. So in 2011, we began a sort of public-facing campaign where we approached our supporters and members on a regular basis, asking them to write to their MPs, take action with us to show the government why it's so important to ban pavement parking throughout England, Scotland and Wales. So we have been contacted by thousands of people since then, detailing why this is so difficult for them, why this is dangerous for them, why at the best it's a nuisance. And we have, done a number of actions. We've presented letters and cards to Downing Street. We have given evidence on transport select committees. And our real aim was to get the consultation that was launched in 2020 from the DfT to hopefully kickstart prohibition of pavement parking throughout the UK. Onto the next slide, please, Deval. So you can see here just a bit of a snapshot of some of the things we've done since the consultation launched. We did have to wait 5 years for a reply, which came this year in January. Just at the end of last year, we launched a map encouraging people to submit pictures and instances of particularly bad pavement parking. You can see the map on the screen there. We received over 1,500 pins showing those worst cases. And we haven't just been focused on England. We did campaign for this in Scotland, a ban on pavement parking, which we were really thrilled to see come in 2019. And it has taken some years to roll out, both because of the COVID pandemic and just the government and local authorities kind of getting to grips with how this primary legislation in Scotland rolled out. But we're pleased to see that the majority of local authorities in Scotland are now enforcing some sort of ban in their areas. And we've also been part of a task force that was looking at pavement parking in Wales. In 2023, we made many recommendations as part of that task force. But I thought I would just mention that unfortunately, work on a ban in Wales specifically seems to have taken a bit of a pause, and it doesn't appear that any of the political parties are mentioning it in their manifestos for this year's elections. On to the next slide, please, Deval. Just wanted to run through a little bit around the consultation response. So 15,300 and something people submitted responses to the consultation. That was 92% of local authorities, 80% of commercial businesses, and 96% were other organisations. And that number was saying that pavement parking is a problem in their area, so extremely high across the board. We saw through the consultation that generally the option that was most favoured was a nationwide ban. Over 70% of respondents across those groups suggested that a nationwide ban would be best. We haven't got that from the written statement from the Minister. This is going to be very much a two-pronged approach, which probably many of you are aware of, with civil enforcement powers for local authorities to sort of find the worst obstructions in their areas. And we're expecting sort of guidance and legislation around that at the end of this year. And then primary legislation to give local leaders the ability to prohibit pavement parking in their areas. And that piece of primary legislation is currently an amendment in the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill. And it's not got very far to go now. It was debated in the Commons yesterday as to some of the amendments, and there were no issues with the pavement parking primary legislation one flagged at that point. So the next stage is tomorrow. It will be debated in the Lords, and we're hoping that amendment reaches royal assent over the coming weeks. On to the next slide, please, Deval. So we also at Living Streets wanted a nationwide ban, but I think that this two-pronged approach could work should local leaders determine that it's worth prohibiting it in their areas. And hopefully this won't lead to a postcode lottery, because I think the stats do speak for themselves. 1 in 10 parents are put off walking their child to school because of pet cars parked on the pavement. That's huge. Walking to school is so healthy, vital for the start of the day, and is a great way to reduce congestion on our streets. I'm sure many of you are aware in the school holidays how much quieter our roads are in local areas. And an FOI to all English local authorities that we ran in 2018, just before the consultation started, showed that 80% of local authorities had received complaints about pavement parking in their areas, and 30% had issued TROs. We know this is a huge problem, and a lot of people want to speak out about it and want to see change. And I think, Adam, you had on your slides about this being a politically sensitive issue. It certainly has been deemed that, but the RAC Foundation ran a poll of their members 2 years ago, and that showed that 65% of drivers want to see a pavement parking ban. I don't think this needs to be a political issue. This is about keeping people safer and giving people the freedom to travel in the way that they want to by walking or wheeling on their local streets. So on to the next slide, please, Deval. So in terms of accessibility, we hear a lot from our supporters and members about how pavement parking stops them from leaving the house. So polls that we've run in the last few years have shown that 73% of over 65s say that pavement parking is a problem in their local area, and a quarter of over 65s, which is circa sort of 3 million people, are actually prevented from leaving their house because cars are parked on pavements and pavements are obstructed. So this is huge. It is putting people off leaving their homes. It's increasing loneliness and isolation, and that in turn increases poor health. Research shows that only 5% of drivers are sort of aware of all aspects of current law on pavement parking. And I think this is really key to the rollout, is communicating the changes to the general population, which is one of the main reasons that we wanted a nationwide ban, because it allows consistency of message, it allows consistency of rollout. But so I think it's going to be really vital for local authorities and local leaders to be communicating in local press about when and where bans start rolling out. Next slide, please, Deval. So in terms of the personal impact, we've got three people who have been really key to our campaigns, key to supporting our campaigns, talking about how pavement parking affects their lives. So on the very left, we have Juno, who's in her early 20s and she lives in Cardiff. All three of these people do rely heavily on wheelchair use. And for Juno, I think the main issue is accessibility for her. She told us that generally 15-minute trips that used to take her 15 minutes now take her 45 minutes because of obstructions on pavement, her having to reroute, cross roads, travel around, stop at traffic lights, that sort of thing to avoid parked cars. And she's found it so difficult that she set up an Instagram page called Accessible Cardiff, which is highlighting the issue of pavement parking near where she lives. In the middle of the three pictures, we have Aideen. She lives in the West Midlands. She's a mother of two boys and is often on the school run, taking them to school. One day when she was on the school run, she had to navigate a parked car and she was forced into the road and unfortunately fell out of her wheelchair. She wasn't hurt, but the impact it's had on her confidence has been huge. And it's that fright that she's in the road with her sons. It puts her off doing the school run herself. And so she's had many times where she actually has had to stop journeys because she can't get past parked cars as well. And then Maya, on the right-hand side, is a retired civil engineer from Birmingham and has muscular dystrophy. And in 2022, he'd just crossed a road at a pedestrian crossing and then found himself blocked by a vehicle parked on the pavement. He had to go into the road and unfortunately fell out of his wheelchair and received quite serious injuries. Had to wait for some time for anyone to come along and see him in the road, and spent some time in A&E. And he said it was terrifying. He's still shaken up by it, and it's affected his confidence to go out in his wheelchair. So this is real life. This is putting people off leaving the house, resulting in injury, and it has to stop. So last slide for me, please, Deval. So at the moment, our streets aren't set up to protect people's safety. Pavement parking is part of the problem, as are high speeds and motor dominance. We need a safe systems approach to ensure our streets are mitigating human error and reducing speed and volume of vehicles. Our pavements should be for people and people alone, not vehicles, not charging points, not clutter. Our public spaces need to be protected for use for those who need them, whether they are on wheel or on foot. Curbside strategies like the one published in Lambeth support a vision where more of our public space is set aside for people rather than often idle vehicles. Our pedestrian pound report shows that when walkable realm is introduced and prioritised, local economies benefit as well as the health of residents and community. And while Living Street supports exemption on streets which couldn't safely carry a pavement parking ban, we want to see new homes and towns to be set up better to support car-free streets. Think areas for parking residential cars, not covering every street. And by slowing speeds, enforcing bad driver behaviour and educating all that pedestrians are the most vulnerable and keeping our pavements free for pedestrians, we can better protect all and give people the freedom they all deserve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tanya. That's really, really interesting, and the real life examples. I mean, I think we all probably see them every day. I'm going to put you on the spot. Can I was about to say, can I do that? I'm going to do it anyway. You talked about parents not wanting their children to walk to school because of pavement parking. There's a few comments come in, but I've also seen it in my local area that it seems to be the parents that sometimes park on the pavement when dropping their children off. So is that something you've come across, and how do we balance that? One side seems to be blaming the other.
Yeah, I mean, strangely, I don't know why this keeps happening to me, but I'm also a parent of twin children. I meet many twin parents. Hi, Adam. But yeah, I mean, I go on the school run every day and I see what you're talking about. I think that, as kind of Adam talked about as well, having that kind of school streets approach, holistic vision of having fewer cars and traffic around schools, encouraging more parents to give the walk or cycle or wheel consideration, park and stride, park 10 minutes away from school, because it is such a safety issue outside of schools. I worry every single day, picking my son up, that there are, conflicting people moving in different ways. They're always in it's a rush, picking up when everybody's there. It's just it's not a nice safe space to be, and it is a bit chicken and egg. Parents are scared about their children's safety because of the issue of cars around school gates and near schools in general, so they think it's better to get into the car. And it's not about blaming people, it's the way our streets are built, it's the policies that are in place that is kind of allowed for this status quo. And I think we need to just dial that back, or move towards a better future where it's so much harder to take your car, and it is so much easier and so much more pleasant, and everyone understands that, to walk or cycle or wheel. Because like I sort of said, the benefits to children of walking or being active at the start of the day, I think we all know the benefits of being active is so huge, not only for their physical health, but their mental health, their concentration in class. And so, we need.
No, well, thank you. Sorry to just drop you in like that. A lot of comments are coming in about the joined up approach and the state of the streets, and they perhaps weren't designed for very large cars, etc. So, Deval, can we have a quick look at question number 2 and 3? Can you put the poll up, see the results of that? I'd be interested to see how the voting's gone. While Deval drops that up, I will introduce Nick, but I won't ask you to start yet, Nick. We can't show your screen until we have a look at the polls. But Nick has been a long-serving servant of parking and enforcement, and probably needs no introduction to many people on this call, and has been a personal friend of mine for many years, and is a wealth of knowledge. So I'm very much looking forward. I purposely didn't look at the slides, so I'm very much looking forward to seeing yours. Deval, are we any closer to getting a poll up? If not, I'm just going to let Nick launch himself. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no, Nick. So if I can hand over to you, and perhaps we can get the polls up towards the end of the presentations for discussion. So Nick, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Gavin. It's a pleasure to speak here today. As you said, I've had a long history in the parking industry in the UK and indeed in Europe, and was responsible to a large part for the initial legislation on civil parking enforcement, and for bringing it into operation initially in London. And I remained responsible as an oversight of parking enforcement and parking controls in London for nearly 25 years. It's a horrific thought, but at least now somebody else has that task. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Deval? Or indeed, the one after that, that's just the title. What I wanted to say, first of all, was about how critically important it is to manage footway parking for all the reasons that both Adam and Tanya have said. I won't go any more into that at the moment, but it is absolutely critically important to get that done effectively, and is long overdue. It's interesting to see that the first legislation on footway parking restrictions was in 1968 in the Transport Act. It was never commenced. And in London, the 1975 GLC General Powers Act introduced footway parking ban in London. That's 50 years ago now. And quite astonishing that it's been allowed to drift on for that length of time in the rest of the country. Some people think that tackling footway parking through enforcement, and enforcement is always going to be a part of the tools to be used, and an important part of the tools to be used, but not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. But the thought was from some people that this is fairly straightforward. And I was reminded of the borough engineer of Hammersmith and Fulham in the early 1990s, when we were just starting civil parking enforcement, and he thought he could have a a book of PCNs on the dashboard of his car, and whenever he saw an illegally parked car, he'd just write one out and stick it on the windscreen. We learnt with experience quite quickly that that sort of approach was a bit naive, and those involved with enforcement will know that it needs precision. It needs precision both operationally, but also legally. There are more than enough motorists who will exploit any chink in the law to try and get off a ticket, and indeed try to undermine the whole process. So to the extent that enforcement is going to be critical for tackling footway parking, we have to get this right. Could I have the next slide, please, Deval? Now, there's one part of civil enforcement which has been consistent throughout, and I think is central to the way that civil parking enforcement and traffic enforcement has worked. And that is that all of the contraventions enforced by local authorities are clearly objective. That is, there are no grey areas. Either a contravention occurs or it does not occur. It's important that there is that objectivity around, because it does start to address the issues of inconsistency, and it starts to address the issues of partiality. And we put a lot of effort, certainly in the early years, to making certain that that carried on. One of the bits of legislation we added on to the 91 Act for London, initially, now for the whole of the country, was to address double parking. And the initial thoughts was, that's easy, you just ban double parking. Well, that started to become problematic, because what exactly is double parking, particularly if the car on the inside has managed to move away? And that's why the restriction is now that you can't park more than half a metre away from the edge of the carriageway, because that made it very clear it was either more or not more. And that made enforcement much simpler and much more straightforward. Now, enforcing pavement parking restrictions do need this certainty. The original 1975 footway parking ban in London was not clear enough, because as soon as enforcement started to happen at any level, we came across all sorts of things like, what if this motorcycle is on its stand with no wheels touching the ground? Does that count as parked on the pavement or not? So we had to redefine what the restriction was, and we redefined it so that you could park only on the carriageway unless there was a specific allowance elsewhere. And it's interesting that the Scottish Parliament's approach respected this and followed a very similar approach. Outside Scotland and London, where enforcement is working well at present, there is a different approach, certainly in Wales, and possibly in England, at least initially, by allowing local authorities to issue PCNs for unnecessary obstruction. This causes some problems. And if we could have the next slide, Deval, please. Using unnecessary obstruction has some clear administrative advantages. There's no need for detailed surveys of where footway parking may or may not be allowed. There's no need for additional signing, which is an important consideration. However, what it does do is to bring in subjective judgments about obstruction and unnecessary, and this causes some significant legal issues. On the question of obstruction, there is a question which would have to be asked, is who is being obstructed and by how much? I know a lot of the campaigners are very keen to ensure that there is sufficient space for a double buggy to be to get past, or a substantial wheelchair to get past. But that is not necessarily the same as how the legal definition would, the legal interpretation would be approached. There is no specific legal definition of obstructive. And so this would raise a number of questions initially. Is the gap left on the pavement sufficient to cause an obstruction? Is it so narrow as to cause obstruction or not? And what happens if there is a choice between obstructing the footway or obstructing the carriageway? These are not policy issues, these are legal issues which would have to be addressed. There'd also be the question of whether you needed somebody actually to be obstructed, or whether it was only a potential obstruction that mattered. If it was an actual obstruction that you needed, you'd need to find somebody who would complain about being obstructed, and that would undermine any approach to deal with, to tackle footway parking at all. And finally, on particularly the question of unnecessary, the question of whose judgment counts. Is it going to be the judgment of the civil enforcement officer on the street that that particular parking was unnecessary or not? Is it the local authority's judgment? Would it be the adjudicator's judgment? In each case, that's uncertain, but what it does mean is that there would be a lot more approach of cases appealed to the adjudicator on the grounds that people had nothing to lose at all. And as it's simply a question of judgment, is it unnecessary, isn't unnecessary, there is always the chance that the adjudicator would come to a different conclusion to that of the civil enforcement officer or the local authority. And that will not stop there, because there will be further cases that get involved with the High Court and the Court of Appeal as these definition issues start to become important. And I suspect that that's likely to lead to enforcement being concentrated only on the unarguable cases, rather than on all issues where problems are caused. And that will necessarily lead to conflict between those, such as Living Streets, and local campaigners who are affected badly by pavement parking, and reluctance of the local authority to get involved in more marginal cases. Be interesting to see, but I think that the subjective judgments brought in through unnecessary obstruction approaches could seriously undermine the objective of the approach. So if we move on to the next slide, please, which is the approach of the English Devolution Bill. Now, this has gone back to a more prescriptive approach. And it will be interesting to see how this is taken forward in the regulations. I think it's now clear that these clauses will be part of the final act. There is no further debate in the House of Lords, because the government and the House of Commons has accepted the Lords' amendments. So that's an end of the matter. It will be in the act. And this approach, as I say, is much more creating a specific contravention of parking on the footway. And interestingly enough, they do follow the London and the Scottish approach by defining this as effectively anywhere but on the carriageway. And that means that verges and other spaces that are ill-defined on the highway will become part of the ban on footway parking where this takes place. But it is a zonal approach that has been adopted, and it is subject to regulations issued by the Secretary of State, and there will be exemptions possible within that zonal approach. So the local authority may be able to exclude specific streets from the zone. But that will then, to my mind, raise two important questions. The first is the question on timing. I'm always a bit skeptical about any approaches, any comments by the government on timing of future announcements, which are based on seasons. And my first question is always, if it's autumn of which year had you in mind? And we know that governmental autumn can stretch from anything from the 1st of July to the 31st of December. So I think it will be necessary for all of those looking for this to take place to continue to put the pressure on the government to make certain that the regulations are produced and are produced in a timely manner. Tanya, I think, said it took 6 years from the consultation on footway parking to produce a response from the government. And it is very clear that the government has a very strong aversion to anything which looks as though it might be bad for motorists. And ministers of all parties have consistently overestimated the real weight of motorists' outcries. And I think if you want some examples of this, the 20-mile-an-hour presumption in Wales, which was bitterly contested politically, in Scotland, which has effectively the same approach, it hasn't become a political issue at all. The ultra-low emission zone, which many thought was responsible for Labour not winning the Uxbridge by-election in 2023, is no longer an issue at all politically. So there is an overestimation in the government about the weight of motorist feelings and how much it will influence voting patterns in the future. But because of that, they are very cautious about doing anything which might then impact on motorists' ability to drive where they want to. So don't hold your breath for the regulations, but keep putting on the pressure, because that will be necessary to get the regulations produced at all. The second part to look out for, in my mind, is in the content. And in particular, the question of the process that the government will require local authorities to go through in terms of creating a zone where footway parking is prohibited. The real risk is that it becomes very similar to the TRO process, which we all know is cumbersome, lengthy, and expensive, and would be a real disincentive for authorities to address. The second issue is on signing. Once you've adopted a zonal approach, what are going to be the signing requirements? Now, the approach in London and in Scotland is that there is a presumption for signing purposes that footway parking is prohibited unless there is a specific sign to say that you can. And that works very well where you have a complete national ban or regional ban in the case of London. If we go to a zonal approach, however, the instinct, I suspect, will be to have a sign on the edge of the zone, say within this zone, footway parking is not allowed, which is fine, but it leads to inconsistency. You move from one place where you need a sign to tell you that footway parking is allowed to another area where you need a sign which tells you that footway parking is not allowed. And that will cause issues coming up about inconsistency and about motorist understanding. So having said that, I think the approach that is being adopted in the English devolution bill has some real prospects for some benefits, so long as, firstly, the government isn't allowed just to put it on the back burner. Secondly, that the content regulations are not too administratively burdensome. And thirdly, that local authorities wishing to adopt this start planning now, in particular, thinking about where you would wish to have footway parking prohibited and where you are prepared to accept it. These will become politically contentious issues, and there's no getting away from it because it's a matter of balance. In many areas, there is not sufficient capacity for both all the parking that people would wish to have and a ban on footway parking. To my mind, that's really what the politician's job is to make those difficult choices where there are choices. There's no easy answer, but that needs preparation, it needs consideration, and it needs working up from now. So I hope that helps. I think that's the end of my contribution. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. Very insightful and useful as always. What I'm going to do is just quickly run through the poll responses that we've received. And Adam, I'm going to come to you first with a query, so pay attention. So pavement parking road safety. Does your authority currently have a defined approach to pavement parking? And as I said, 58% said no. The second question was, would a risk-based scoring approach help your authority prioritise pavement parking interventions? And we've had a 60% saying yes. Question 3 was, how confident is your authority in understanding the parking capacity impacts of enforcing a pavement parking ban? And we've had a 55% of some understanding. The second answer there was limited understanding. So there is obviously some confusion still. And number 4 was about verge parking. Perhaps we'll come back to that, but most people were suggesting that verge parking should be treated in a similar fashion. What is sort of coming across, and also coming across on the chat and in the questions, is the conflicting requirements from different areas of society. And I think, Tony, I might come to you about that in a second. But Adam, should we talk about displacement first? What's going to happen? And let's talk about displacement. Can you also talk about the confusion that may happen? I think Nick's just touched upon it. You'll go from one zone to another, and there'll be different signs. And how are we going to deal with that? How's a local authority deal with all those issues? How can you help a local authority deal with all those issues?
I mean, that's two very different questions, I think, there,
Yes,
Gavin.
yes.
How we, I mean, displacement is a notoriously difficult issue, regardless of whether we're looking at pavement parking, whether you're looking at parking restrictions, CPZs. It is always an issue, and there is always a lot of confusion that you have. We've worked with many local authorities where you have different restrictions on different sides of the road, and lo and behold, there's lots of PCNs that get issued because it can be very difficult to interpret. It's I think the displacement issue is the single biggest matter that we need to try and resolve, because on the face of it, there isn't a clear and obvious solution. If you look at sort of displacement that can occur with school streets for temporary periods of time, if you look at sort of CPZ sort of more widely, what you are doing is you are looking to sort of try and disperse the displacement. So it's going in lots of different areas, and the idea being that it naturally sort of it resolves itself naturally, but that's not going to happen with this because you are probably looking at sort of wider areas you are going to need to address. Can you still hear me okay?
We can still hear you, but you have
Yeah.
frozen.
Okay. Bear with.
Shall I go to Tanya? Why do you
Yeah.
just sort the comms out? Tanya, I was going to ask you about the sort of conflicting requirements. So, as we just touched on earlier, we have the pavement users, we have the drivers, we have the people who have the large cars that hang over the edge of their driveways. Who's going to define, or who would you like to see define what is an obstruction and how big the gap should be? And if I can run through, does that mean it's not obstruction, although I have to slow down? And if a wheelchair can't get through, who's going to make that decision?
Yeah, I mean, this has been discussed by the minister, her team. Chris Boardman's a real supporter of a ban on pavement parking. He's, CEO of Active Travel England. It's hard, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people could argue that they don't really understand what 2 meters looks like, and that is understandable. Phil Jones Associates have done some really brilliant guidance on this because they did it as part of work for the Wales Task Force, where the Welsh government was really only ever considering what the English consultation option 2 was, which was providing the civil enforcement rights for local authorities to obstruct, to find really bad cases of obstruction. So a lot of thought has gone into this, and Patrol were involved, and the British Parking Association, ourselves. So there's been a lot of thinking done, and I think it's probably fair to say that guidance is probably publicly available. And if it isn't, I'm sure Phil Jones Associates would be very happy to share it. It's definitely something the Department for Transport's pavement parking policy team are pulling together, and there is a plan to share some guidance on what this obstruction would look like. I think it's fair to say that they feel that they'll be learning through the process of rolling this out, because there haven't really been tribunal cases with the police up to this point, and I don't think that they can change the meaning of obstruction on the pavement too much, because there's already law that the police are sort of potentially enforcing throughout the UK. I think saying something like, can a double buggy fit through, could be a good way forward, because I think most people can roughly picture how big a double buggy could be. I think that the central government need to provide some guidance for local authorities so that there is some level of consistency, so that people across England understand what's being expected of them, and that there won't be too many cases of members of the public sort of taking the authority to court in any case, where they argue it wasn't clear to them.
Thank you, Nick. Where do you see where do you see the decisions being made? Local level, government level? What would be the best approach, in your opinion?
I suspect that a lot of the decisions will have to be made at a local level, come what may. There are difficult choices that will need to be made in streets where there are capacity restrictions on parking, and where this has been addressed by allowing footway parking in the past. One of the unheralded advantages of civil parking enforcement has that it has made responsibility for making regulations rest with the same people as those who enforce those regulations. And I think the problem we've had with in the past with the use of obstruction is the police basically are not that interested, just as the police weren't particularly interested in parking enforcement prior to civil parking enforcement being introduced. And as soon as you get an enforcement authority which is interested in the issue, and there will be pressure on local authorities to ensure that any footway parking ban is enforced in particular areas, this will bring the difficult decisions right up front. And these can only really be resolved at a local level. And that will be where do we have to say to people, I'm sorry, there is just no space in this road for you to park any more cars, for example, or I'm sorry, we have to allow people to park their cars. There's going to be no space except on the footway for this to happen. And that's a political decision. It's what we elect politicians to make that sort of decision for. Now, I suspect that there is a short-term and a long-term issue within that. And this relates very much to displacement, because what we have seen over time is that car ownership in any area is limited by the amount of overnight parking available. And this has been researched by quite a lot over the years. And you get places like Kensington, which is one of the wealthiest parts of the country, with extremely low levels of car ownership. And the reason for that is there's nowhere to put them. But it does take time for that process to work itself out. There are ways in which local authorities can help this process along, and these rely on population turnover. So, for example, an authority could say, we are not going to issue residence parking permits freely to newcomers. We'll continue to renew those that exist, but we have a limit to how many new parking permits we're prepared to issue in any one particular year. And that would take some of the political pain away, but it will be tricky. The easy political answer is for them to do nothing and to leave things as it stands. But the value of having this legislation around that allows local authorities to do the enforcement is that they will no longer be able to say, well, the enforcement is somebody else's problem. It's not down to us. And that's been the issue up till now.
There's a lot of comments coming in about cost, having been involved in enforcement for many local authorities over the last 30 odd years. A lot of people are asking, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for the extra resources? We know that camera enforcement can't be used. So do you think central government would be paying for this? Would be? It was a slightly rhetorical question, sorry, slightly sarcastic question. Do you think any money will be forthcoming for local authorities to impose this pavement parking ban?
I think it's worth noting that for most authorities, enforcement of parking covers its costs. When you include the income from paid for parking, both on street and in local authority car parks, many authorities have large surpluses. And that would be the place, I think, that they should start to look at it. The legislation requires that where the parking account is in surplus, the first call is on more issues to deal with parking. And only after that, when the authority determines that further expenditure on parking is either unnecessary or undesirable, can it be spent on anything else? So it seems to me that there is a first port of call that can be looked for. Now, that won't work for every authority, but it is the sort of thing that if I was in an area with serious footway parking problems, I would be looking to see where the rest of the parking regime works in that area, and looking particularly at the cost of short stay and long stay parking. We know that in principle for short stay parking, authorities should be aiming that their charges allow for 85% occupancy. Now, most authorities are undercharging to achieve that. And it doesn't actually achieve very much undercharging, it just creates more congestion. So that's one of the areas to look at. And similarly, almost every local authority subsidizes its residence parking schemes. Some still give residence parking permits for free. And that's a subsidy. It's a straightforward subsidy. And that's another area they might be looking at in terms of the ways to find resources to make footway parking restrictions work.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Adam, are you back with us?
I am, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. I don't know if that was us or you. Apologies for that to everybody. Can we carry on the conversation about sort of displacement and who's going to make these decisions? What's the cunning plan from Ethos to assist local authorities?
Well, I suppose it goes back to sort of being able to demonstrate a clear and obvious sort of priority. I think you can't, it's going to be unrealistic to expect every single street to be subject to the ban. So I think initially, or at least in its early phases, we probably need to sort of try and address the priority areas first. So I think trying to integrate it in policy is going to be really important. Having a strong strategy and policy that your members buy into. I think there's nothing more powerful than having a document that your members approve and sign off of, because in effect you're then asking them to go into bat for you when it comes to holding this up in reality, because it's all very well supporting strategy, supporting policy, but when it actually comes to the crux of it, when you're trying to deliver that, sometimes that that support can sort of fall away a bit, especially if there is a lot of opposition. So I know um, some local authorities are really good with having their members support documents, and they are very much supporting their officers when they're going through the process. Others less so. So I think that's really important to have that sort of consistency. And the best way to get members on side is to try to demonstrate that um, we're not just doing this as a sort of as a blanket order. There is a clear rationale behind it. There's an evidence behind it. There's a defendable position, and then going out to consultation to try and get as many people to support the process, I think. So pedestrians can have a key role in that. Advocates, people that do walk, people that do cycle, I think they've all got opportunities to sort of provide a balanced argument, because a lot of the time, and it's interesting sort of hearing Tanya sort of talk about sort of the amount of motorists that were supporting consultations. That's great. I think sometimes when it comes to sort of big changes like this, there can be a default position that can emerge. So if we can get as many people supporting the policies and reflecting that as part of consultation, it I think strengthens the argument when it comes to the opposition that will be experienced.
So it's been said on the Q&A that enforcement of pavement parking can only be carried out within CPZ. What's going to happen in the villages, outside where the streets are potentially smaller and people are parking on the pavement, have been doing for years? Are they suddenly going to get hammered, or are they not? Would it not be counted as justifiable? What would be your opinion on that?
I think
Again, I think sorry to interrupt you.
one thing is clear from the amendment to the bill that was agreed yesterday, is that it's not limited to CPZs, but it is limited to areas where the civil enforcement is taking place. So
Okay, that's interesting.
One of the reasons for that is not to put any burden on the police.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of that yesterday. Tanya, can I ask you perhaps a final question? There's again lots of comments coming in, lots of comments, not questions actually, which is interesting. Lots of comments and very conflicting. And bear in mind, we all work in sort of transportation and enforcement and parking. It's interesting that we even with our industry, there's conflict, for want of a better word. Do you think car size and car ownership and this? Do you think these are all connected? And how do we disentangle that? Do we stop people having cars? Do we stop, if you live in a town, you can only have one car? Can you not pave over your garden? Is this all connected in your eyes?
Yes, I think it is all connected. I mean, someone has just mentioned in the chat the better connected, what was the integrated national transport strategy before it got rebranded. And I think that there is quite a lot in there that's really great around, active travel and, walking, wheeling and cycling being sort of heroed and having more of a part to play, and public transport, buses and trains needing to receive investment. And there seems to be a lot of talk about buses receiving investment at the moment. It's definitely all connected. It's been really enlightening for me to hear a lot of the discussion today around the realities of the displacement of the vehicles that won't be able to park on pavements potentially, should they be prohibited in certain areas. And the reality is that we would like there to be fewer cars on our roads to make them safer, to make them nicer places to be, so that we can start to see children playing outside again, so that local economies can be boosted. So maybe there does need to be more disincentives to driving. I don't think anyone is suggesting banning people from having more than one car per household or anything like that, but there being sort of fairly reflected pricing on those that own cars, and the understanding that by choosing more sustainable modes, whether that be walking and cycling or buses and trains, that you're supporting your local economy, the wider economy, the health and the community, and investing more in those areas, and investing a bit less in the strategic road network and motor vehicles.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a joined up approach seems to be the way forward.
Yeah.
If I could just ask you all sort of perhaps one final question, Adam, if you could ask the DFT for one thing, what would it be? And I'm talking about connected to pavement parking. Clarity, uniformity.
Yeah, I think clear, structured guidance, I think, would probably be my ask. There's a risk with this that, I mean, and it might be forthcoming, but there's a lot of it that seems to be sort of expectations at the moment. And without that sort of structured guidance, I think it makes it very difficult for local authorities to plan. So I think a real strong sort of structured guidance for how we can move this forward. It could be linked to roles and responsibilities. I think something around funding as well. I think sort of Nick's point around sort of parking being a bit of a self sort of serving revenue sort of funder is absolutely spot on. But I do think that there should be, this integrates a lot with policy and strategy. And I think a amount of funding that could be made available for local authorities to do that sort of that strategy policy element, without having to dip into sort of revenue funding, would then get local authorities to the position they've got something quicker, and then the natural sort of opportunity for the revenue that comes from enforcement can then sort of probably maintain that moving forward. There's been a few comments I've seen in the chat around PCN sort of being too low. I completely agree with that. I think we saw the really good work that BCP Council did last year, with more sort of stringent controls around seafronts, and I know the sort of the Pan London increase on PCNs appears to be providing some level of discouragement. So I think giving local authorities some additional powers, maybe to make some more localized decisions based on what they see coming from the policy and the strategy, could also be really effective as well. But clarity and guidance, I think, will be the biggest ask.
Can I ask, Tanya, can I ask you the same question, and I'll come to you, Nick, for the final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would like to see central government clearly communicate to the public as well the next steps on this, because I think it is a lot to expect every local authority to clearly communicate exactly what is going on across the country, because many people will live in one borough or county and travel to the next. And I think there needs to be an element of overarching guidance and understanding to all of what to expect as drivers.
That's coming across very clearly in the chat as well, actually, which obviously you can all see. Nick?
Yes, I mean, I was going to say something very similar. The one thing I would wish for out of this is a big publicity campaign. The GLC started its enforcement with a big publicity campaign, and that helped. So if the government would do a big publicity campaign on the importance of controlling footway parking and eliminating it in difficult places, that would be great.
I think that's what's coming across very clearly: consistency, guidance, publicity, communication, etc. The final poll question came through that I've just seen, and I think the good news is that this is clearly a subject that's not going to go away. I think a lot of people share the view of the panel that it's taken the government 5.5, 6 years to get to where we are from the initial consultation, and therefore this discussion will keep going. So I think it's something like 43% of people would like to have some kind of follow-up of this conference, another webinar, etc. So Landor Links will do that. Can I just thank the panel on behalf of Landor Links, Tanya, Nick, and Adam, and thank Ethos for sponsoring this. It's been really useful for me, and I hope it's been useful. We've had a consistent number of people stay on the call, which is great news. The slides will be available afterwards. But again, thank you very much to the panel, and thank you, Ethos, for your sponsorship of today. And I look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.